Chapter 8, You Ain't Seen Nothin' Yet, May 20th, 1856. They had only 3 months of the year, but somehow they accomplished as much as James had covered in a whole year in Boston. Miss Malone was working them like beasts of the field. James had all of his books and pen and ruler and his sketchbook in a canvas bag slung over his back. No telling where Jeremy Macon and Will Bowers had tossed their books. He walked between them, and they were boxing at his shoulders and ears in a playful way. "Just kidding. Can't you take a joke?" they said. But James thought they were doing their best to provoke him into punching back. Well, in a minute, they passed Bethany Maxwell's house, and Jeremy jerked his shirt down so that he'd look less like a rabble-rouser in case Bethany happened to be peeking out from behind those prissy blue lace curtains. James barely lifted his head so Jeremy wouldn't see him watching for Bethany, but he thought he saw her walk past an upstairs window, and his heart leapt. "Will you look at that?" Jeremy said, pointing to Mount Orrin, a mere bump on the face of the earth. It nevertheless towered over the city of Lawrence, and now it seemed to be crawling with men. James took advantage of the diversion to slip away from his friends. Friends, ha! Not like the boys back home, but better than no one. Will said, "What do you think they're doing up there?" "Ain't no picnic. Looks like they're fixing to go to war," Jeremy said, and he and Will gleefully rubbed their hands together as if they were warming them over a pot-bellied stove. James studied the hill. There were not just men up there, but horses and tents. It looked like they'd been camping for a good long time. Smoke swirled up from a campfire, as if it had been called out by a snake charmer. "Want to climb up and investigate?" Will asked. "Not on your life, moron," Jeremy answered. "Those men look mean and evil as weevils." Mean? How could Jeremy tell from so far away? And evil, well, that was something altogether different, but just the same, James thought they should head home. "Well, my pa's expecting me to help him butcher a hog," he said, though it wasn't true, and his father wouldn't have the first inkling about which end to butcher and which end to kiss. "We butcher hogs in the winter time, city boy." Just then he noticed a few horses trailing down the mountain. 3, 4. The horses got closer, and James's heart began to synchronize with the cloppity sound of their hoofs. Looked like trouble. But it was just 3 men on not very spectacular horses, a patchy-looking bay, and 2 dapples that sure weren't thoroughbreds. The lead rider nosed up to James. "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Fane, here on federal business." James stepped aside to let the horses pass. "These boys is my posse." The posse looked newly utilized and not too fearsome. James's heart slowed down. Will asked, "What you in town for, Marshal Fane?" "Looking for slave stealers." "You ain't gonna find none here," Jeremy said. "We're, every one of us, law-abiding citizens. James Weaver's pa, he's even a lawyer." But Marshal Fane wasn't about to be put off by a mangy flock of boys. "There's been people stealing these Negroes, and there's people hiding 'em out." James' chest tightened. Should he run for home? But what if the marshal got suspicious and followed him home and went after Ma? What if he asked if they'd seen any runaway slaves, and Rebecca blabbed all about it to the ones that had been sleeping in their bedrooms and attic, sometimes so many of them that they put bedrolls all over the floor and they had to eat in shifts? Too risky. So James stayed out. People came out of Round Corner Drugstore to see what was going on. Mr. Bonds, who had a seed store, left it unattended, and some mourners streamed out of the funeral parlor, and Ladies' Sewing Circle broke up from the Unitarian Church, and suddenly the streets were swarming with Lawrence folks. James saw Mrs. Bonds sidle up to her husband, a big elephant of a woman. She held a rifle flat against her flank. Who does that remind you of? Grandma Dowdle. Marshal Fane slid off his horse and shouted for everyone to be quiet. He showed his badge around in a wide circle. The sun caught it just so, and James winced. Everyone got quiet. Marshal Fane parked himself in the doorway of the Free State Hotel, and he made a little speech that no one much admired. "We aim to clear nigger stealers out of this town. Authority of the government of the United States of America." The Lawrence people booed and yelled. "Run him out of town," one cried. "Out of the country," another said. "Kansas Territory is free soil." One woman elbowed her way through the throng and spit at the marshal. He wiped the spit off with the back of his hand and yelled, "Once a slave, always a slave, even on so-called free soil. I want every one of them niggers back and every slave stealer behind bars. Go jump in the Wakarusa, Mrs. Bonds yelled, while her husband tried to shush her. A member of the posse motioned to the marshal for attention. I'm General Atchison, he bellowed, upstaging the marshal. His voice boomed above the din of the crowd. My mama taught me every lady was to be respected, but if she's carrying a Sharp's rifle, she's no longer worthy of respect. I say, by God, trample her under your feet as you would a snake. And then Mr. Bonds picked up a sizable stone and hurled it at the general, right? Because I don't blame Mr. Bonds for throwing a rock, because the general just told everybody, go ahead and trample his wife, who has a rifle. And she's a big elephant of a woman.
How are you supposed to trample it?
Then Mr. Bonds picked up a sizable stone and hurled it at the general. All hell broke loose. The men swarmed Marshal Fane and the posse. Mrs. Bonds fired her rifle in the air. Will and Jeremy couldn't wait to get in on the fracas, and they pushed forward with their fists swinging. Marshal Fane grabbed them both with his beefy arms. Get your hands off those boys, cried Mrs. Bonds. Somebody, run and get their daddies. That's what James could have done to help, but he was locked in place, sure as his feet were nailed to the ground. Anyway, Will and Jeremy broke loose just as a troop of men rushed toward the marshal again, their arms raised viciously. Hold it, yelled the editor of one of the Lawrence papers. He's a federal official. Better believe it, the general muttered. Look out, someone yelled. Jeremy and Will backed off towards James, and in a minute, quick as a calf is roped, Mr. Bonds was handcuffed behind his back, and so was his missus. The marshal grabbed up her rifle before a Lawrence man could scramble for it. And then a larger posse rode down from Mount Oread, some dozen men with muskets and bayonets. Each led a barebacked horse. Recently, it seemed like half the men in town were under arrest, though Lord knew where the marshal would keep all the prisoners, because the Lawrence jail only held 3 drunks at best. Somehow Marshal Fane got their attention again and shouted, I'm confident we've got all the trouble causers and the nigger stealers, and if you'll just clear a path for us, we'll be on our way to Lecompton. The posse loaded the prisoners onto the horses, not necessarily one to a horse, and they rode off. A fierce-looking tiger of a man, a Missouri border ruffian for sure, was bringing up the rear. He turned back to the women and children frozen like trees in the streets, and he roared, You ain't seen nothing yet. And then, instead of following the marshal's parade to Lecompton, he yanked his horse around and galloped back up to the men watching from Mount Oread. It was turning dusk. James picked up his book bag and felt a wrenching certainty, like something being tugged out of his gut. Come morning, those men would be down here, but not in 3s and 4s, in the hundreds.